On Hitler and Christianity. I want to begin by explaining a little of my truth journey so far and why I decided to read Table Talk for myself. I wanted to know firsthand what Hitler said and not rely on what others told me he said. And I wanted to get to the bottom of Hitler's views on Christianity. Prior to reading Table Talk, certain things already weren't adding up. When you study Hitler, you find out that he had a memorial grove built for the 4,500 brave men under Wittekind that were beheaded by Charlemagne in October 782 AD at the massacre of Verdun. The reason being that they wouldn't convert from their native Germanic paganism to Christianity. The following year, as proof of Charlemagne's fanatic resolve to force the remaining Saxons into Roman Catholicism, he issued a legal code called the Capitulatio de Paribus Saxonae, which included more beheadings for any Saxon who refused to convert. Why would Hitler honor these men if he was a Christian? Wittekind, or White Kind, the name of a principal king in the Saxons' war against Charlemagne. Some render Wittekind as White Child, but it was originally written Wittekindus, which would translate as very celebrated or known. Both are quite fitting. I was also told that one proof of Hitler being a Christian was that he had Gott mit uns put on his soldiers' belt buckles. But wouldn't he put Jesus mit uns if he was Christian? And if he was instead a pagan, wouldn't he put Gotter mit uns, which is gods in the plural? He did have God in the singular put on the belt buckles. So I would say Hitler was a monotheist, a belief in one creator, but not necessarily a Christian. Table Talk is a collection of dictations by Hitler's private secretary, Martin Bormann, from Hitler's candid discussions over meals with guests. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard of this book, Table Talk, and you have also most likely heard that it is a forgery. Where else have we heard of books being forgeries? Let's see. There is the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. But when we read that book, we see that all the items in it have come true or are coming true as we speak. So I wouldn't say that book is a forgery. That book is one of their playbooks. Any other books considered forgeries? Oh yes, the Orlinda book, the OLB for short, has also been called a forgery. I wonder why. Could it be because it gives the true history and philosophy of the Fryan race, and that this history sheds light on the Magi, who are the Jews of today? That book is also not a forgery. Many good scholars have gone through and verified its authenticity. Well, Table Talk is no different. They claim this book is a forgery because they want you to believe Hitler was a Christian. This fits with their agenda. But what Hitler actually does is expose Christianity for what it truly is and exposes the fact that the Jews are behind it. So there are things in this book that Hitler discusses that might rub some of you the wrong way, but you have to remember that Hitler was from a different generation and not so politically correct as someone from present day. He was less brainwashed. Also, he says things that many of us are thinking, but just not brave enough to articulate. He was a free-spoken man, and his conversations are brutally honest. In them, you can't deny the love he shows for his people. You will also see what a lover of the arts he was, lover of beauty, and above all, lover of the natural world. But for today's discussion, I want to mainly focus on Hitler's views on religion, and Christianity in particular. He is a philosopher with a keen eye for observation, and I've come away with a better understanding of the world in which we live and our place in it thanks to Adolf Hitler. So let's begin. Pertinent Hitler quotes have a blue background, and interspersed OLB quotes have a green background. Night of 11th to the 12th July 1941. I think the man who contemplates the universe with his eyes wide open is the man with the greatest amount of natural piety, not in the religious sense, but in the sense of an intimate harmony with things. Man has discovered in nature the wonderful notion of that almighty being whose law he worships. Fundamentally, in everyone, there is this feeling for the Almighty, which we call God, that is to say, the dominion of natural laws throughout the whole universe. The priests, who have always succeeded in exploiting this feeling, threaten punishments for the man who refuses to accept the creed they impose. When one provokes in a child a fear of the dark, one awakens in him a feeling of atavistic dread. Thus, this child will be ruled all his life by this dread, whereas another child, who has been intelligently brought up, will be free of it. Hitler is, of course, implying here that the priests teach children that they will burn in hell if they don't conform to the view of the church. This is a hard one to break for most people, even as adults, because it affects a primal instinct in our being, one of self-preservation. It's said that every man needs a refuge where he can find consolation and help in unhappiness. I don't believe it. If humanity follows that path, it's solely a matter of tradition and habit. That's a lesson, by the way, that can be drawn from the Bolshevik front. The Russians have no God, and that doesn't prevent them from being able to face death. We don't want to educate anyone on atheism. So from this we know Hitler is not an atheist. Night of 17th to the 18th July 1941. In the long run, National Socialism and religion will no longer be able to exist together. The ideal solution would be to leave the religions to devour themselves without persecutions. But in that case, we must not replace the church by something equivalent. That would be terrifying. It goes without saying that the whole thing needs a lot of thought. Everything will occur in due time. It is a simple question of honesty. That's what it will finally boil down to. We can see that Hitler believes in God, but not in religion. In England, the status of the individual in relation to the church is governed by considerations of state. In America, it's all purely a matter of conformism. The German people's special quality is patience, and it's the only one of the peoples capable of undertaking a revolution in this sphere. It could do it, if only for the reason that only the German people have made moral law the governing principle in action. Remember, from the OLB, how the Germana, the Germans, lived thousands of years in the foreign land of India, but came back with their race, culture, language, and laws intact. They abided by the moral laws within their breasts, placed there by Waralda. From the writings of Fretherick on the new arrivals of Fryans to the motherland in the OLB, we read, "The Geertmannen I can readily pass by. I have not had much to do with them, but as far as I have seen, they have mostly retained their language and customs. I cannot say that of the others." And in America, It is purely a matter of conformism. How pious are people living here today? Not very. Most don't even attend church. But say you are not a Christian and you become an outcast. Your fellow Americans will look down on you as if you are less, with disdain and pity. Christianity is truly the religion of intolerance. And here we have some hard-hitting truth from Hitler. The heaviest blow that ever struck humanity was the coming of Christianity. Bolshevism is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew. The deliberate lie in the matter of religion was introduced into the world by Christianity. Bolshevism practices a lie of the same nature when it claims to bring liberty to men, whereas in reality it seeks only to enslave them. In the ancient world, the relations between men and gods were founded on an instinctive respect. It was a world enlightened by the idea of tolerance. Christianity was the first creed in the world to exterminate its adversaries in the name of love. Its key note is intolerance. Without Christianity, we should not have had Islam. The Roman Empire, under Germanic influence, would have developed in the direction of world domination, and humanity would not have extinguished 15 centuries of civilization at a single stroke. Let it not be said that Christianity brought man the life of the soul, for that evolution was in the natural order of things. So Hitler makes it clear that he believes Christianity and Bolshevism are two sides of the same coin. So when people say World War II was really a war between Christianity and Bolshevism, that is a lie. And Hitler is most definitely not a Christian. Night of 21st to 22nd July 1941. It's certain that Luther had no desire to mold humanity to the letter of the Scriptures. He has a whole series of reflections in which he clearly sets himself against the Bible. He recognizes that it contains a lot of bad things. But Luther had the merit of rising against the Pope and the organization of the Church. It was the first of the great revolutions. Night of 23rd September 1941. The elements of which our body is made belong to the cycle of nature, and as for our soul, it's possible that it might return to limbo until it gets an opportunity to reincarnate itself, but it would vex me if everybody wanted to have done with life. To make death easier for people, the Church holds out to them the bait of a better world. We, for our part, confine ourselves to asking man to fashion his life worthily. For this, it is sufficient for him to conform to the laws of nature. Let's seek inspiration in these principles, and in the long run will triumph over religion. But there will never be any possibility of National Socialism's setting out to ape religion by establishing a form of worship. Its one ambition must be scientifically to construct a doctrine that is nothing more than an homage to reason. Our duty is to teach men to see whatever is lovely and truly wonderful in life, and not to become prematurely ill-tempered and spiteful. We wish fully to enjoy what is beautiful, to cling to it, and to avoid, as far as possible, anything that might do harm to people like ourselves. Hitler actually made a campaign called Strength Through Joy to give the folk a better life. He wanted them to be happy, to enjoy nature, the arts, and to have a chance of leisure to take holiday cruises to the Mediterranean. Kraft durch Freude, strength through joy. If today you do harm to the Russians, it is so as to avoid giving them the opportunity of doing harm to us. God does not act differently. He suddenly hurls the masses of humanity onto the earth, and he leaves it to each one to work out his own salvation. Men dispossess one another, and one perceives that, at the end of it all, it is always the stronger who triumphs. Is that not the most reasonable order of things? If it were otherwise, nothing good would ever have existed. The OLB shares a similar philosophy. In it we read, Fryan has brought us to the path, and the carrier, that is time, must do the rest. For all calamities there is counsel and remedy to be found, but Walda wills that we should seek it out ourselves, in order that we may become strong and wise. If we will not do that, he leaves us to our own devices, in order that we may experience the results of wise or foolish conduct. If we do not respect the laws of nature, imposing our will by the right of the stronger, a day would come when the wild animals would once again devour us. Then the insects would eat the wild animals, and finally nothing would exist on earth but the microbes. Night of 27th through 28th September 1941. The Church has been able to profit by this conception of life. It proclaims that the poor in spirit, and the other poor too, will go to heaven, whilst the rich will pay with eternal sufferings for the blessings of earthly existence. The Church is moved to say this by the tacit contract between the priests and the possessors, who joyfully leave the Church a little money so that it may go on encouraging the poor to grovel. The OLB says a similar thing to Hitler. We read about the cunning of the Church. Although they knew that Jesus had taught that men should regulate and control their passions, they taught that men should stifle their passions, and that the perfection of humanity consisted in being as unfeeling as the cold stones. In order to make the people believe that they did as they preached, they pretended poverty, and that they had overcome all sensual feelings. They took no wives. But if any young girl had made a false step, it was quickly forgiven. The weak, they said, were to be assisted, and to save their souls, men must give largely to the Church. 10th October 1941, midday. Christianity is a rebellion against natural law, a protest against nature. Taken to its logical extreme, Christianity would mean the systematic cultivation of the human failure. 14th October 1941, midday. An educated man retains a sense of the mysteries of nature and bows before the unknowable. An uneducated man, on the other hand, runs the risk of going over to atheism, which is a return to the state of the animal. As soon as he perceives that the state, in sheer opportunism, is making use of false ideas in the matter of religion, whilst in other fields it bases everything on pure science. So it's not opportune to hurl ourselves now into a struggle with the churches. The best thing is to let Christianity die a natural death. A slow death has something comforting about it. The dogma of Christianity gets worn away before the advances of science. Religion will have to make more and more concessions. Gradually the myths crumble. All that's left is to prove that in nature there is no frontier between the organic and the inorganic. So Hitler believed that religions would die a natural death as man realized the lies of the priests and the truths of our world through reason. Nobody has the right to deprive simple people of their childish certainties until they've acquired others that are more reasonable. Indeed, it's most important that the higher belief should be well established in them before the lower belief has been removed. We must finally achieve this, but it would serve no purpose to replace an old belief by a new one that would merely fill the place left vacant by its predecessor. It seems to me that nothing would be more foolish than to reestablish the worship of Wotan. Our old mythology had ceased to be viable when Christianity implanted itself. Nothing dies unless it is moribund. At that period, the ancient world was divided between the systems of philosophy and the worship of idols. It's not desirable that the whole of humanity should be stultified, and the only way of getting rid of Christianity is to allow it to die little by little. Here we see that Hitler did not know of the OLB. If he did, he would have known that from our earliest history, our ancestors had a belief in one creator, Woralda, and based his creation on natural philosophy. Heinrich Himmler knew of the OLB at this point in time, but we can infer here that he didn't share it with Hitler. Himmler wrote Voice of Our Ancestors, where he mentions Woralda in 1935, approximately 6 years before Hitler's thoughts here. The OLB also discusses the man, Odin, who was a Fryan general. He betrayed his people and allowed himself to be beguiled by the Magi and their promises of power and worship. In the OLB, we read upon Odin's death, his reign lasted 7 years, and then he disappeared. The Magi said that he was taken up by their gods, and that he reigned from there over them. But our people laughed at what he said. Science cannot lie, for it's always striving, according to the momentary state of knowledge, to deduce what is true. When it makes a mistake, it does so in good faith. It's Christianity that's the liar. It's in perpetual conflict with itself. Of course, Hitler is a little naive on this point. We know that heliocentrism was brought to us by Nicholas Copernicus, that Isaac Newton put forth his nonsensical laws of gravity, and that rascal Albert Einstein presented us with his bogus theory of relativity. These scientists, and many others, have been duping the public ever since. Science shouldn't lie, but we know that the Jews and their cronies will lie about everything to their advantage. One may ask whether the disappearance of Christianity would entail the disappearance of the belief in God. That's not to be desired. The notion of divinity gives most men the opportunity to concretize the feeling they have of supernatural realities. Why should we destroy this wonderful power they have of incarnating the feeling for the divine that is within them? The man who lives in communion with nature necessarily finds himself in opposition to the churches, and that's why they're heading for ruin, for science is bound to win. I especially wouldn't want our movement to acquire a religious character and institute a form of worship. It would be appalling for me, and I would wish I'd never lived if I were to end up in the skin of a Buddha. As for the men close to me who, like me, have escaped from the clutches of dogma, I've no reason to fear that the church will get its hooks on them. We'll see to it that the churches cannot spread abroad teachings in conflict with the interests of the state. We shall continue to preach the doctrine of National Socialism, and the young will no longer be taught anything but the truth. Night of 17th October 1941. The precept that it's men's duty to love one another is theory, and the Christians are the last to practice it. A Negro baby who has the misfortune to die before a missionary gets his clutches on him goes to hell. If that were true, one might well lament that sorrowful destiny to have lived only 3 years and to burn for all eternity with Lucifer. Night of 19th October 1941. The reason why the ancient world was so pure, light, and serene was that it knew nothing of the two great scourges, the pox and Christianity. Christianity is a prototype of Bolshevism, the mobilization by the Jew of the masses of slaves with the object of undermining society. Thus, one understands that the healthy elements of the Roman world were proof against this doctrine. Yet Rome today allows itself to reproach Bolshevism with having destroyed the Christian churches, as if Christianity hadn't behaved in the same way towards the pagan temples. We know today that many Christian churches were built over pagan temple sites. What hypocrisy. 21st October 1941, midday. Originally, Christianity was merely an incarnation of Bolshevism, the destroyer. Nevertheless, the Galilean, who was later called Christ, intended something quite different. He must be regarded as a popular leader who took up his position against Jewry. Galilee was a colony where the Romans had probably installed Gallic legionnaires, and it's certain that Jesus was not a Jew. The Jews, by the way, regarded him as the son of a whore and a Roman soldier. The decisive falsification of Jesus' doctrine was the work of St. Paul. He gave himself to this work with subtlety and for purposes of personal exploitation. For the Galilean's object was to liberate his country from Jewish oppression. He set himself against Jewish capitalism, and that's why the Jews liquidated him. Paul of Tarsus, his name was Saul before the road to Damascus, was one of those who persecuted Jesus most savagely. When he learned that Jesus' supporters let their throats be cut for his ideas, he realized that by making intelligent use of the Galileans' teaching, it would be possible to overthrow this Roman state, which the Jews hated. It's in this context that we must understand the famous illumination. Think of it. The Romans were daring to confiscate the most sacred thing the Jews possessed, the gold piled up in their temples. At that time as now, money was their god. The Jews' prophets are prophets, and they worship the moon eye, money. On the road to Damascus, St. Paul discovered that he could succeed in ruining the Roman state by causing the principle to triumph of the equality of all men before a single God, and by putting beyond the reach of the laws his private notions, which he alleged to be divinely inspired. If, into the bargain, one succeeded in imposing one man as the representative on earth of the only God, that man would possess boundless power. Think of it today. What do you think is going to happen today with their NWO? The ancient world had its gods and served them, but the priests interposed between the gods and men were servants of the state, for the gods protected the city. In short, they were the emanation of a power that the people had created. For that society, the idea of an only God was unthinkable. In this sphere, the Romans were tolerance itself. The idea of a universal God could seem to them only a mild form of madness, for if 3 peoples fight one another, each invoking the same God, this means that, at any rate, 2 of them are praying in vain. Nobody was more tolerant than the Romans. Every man could pray to the God of his choice, and a place was even reserved in the temples for the unknown God. Moreover, every man prayed as he chose, and had the right to proclaim his preferences. St. Paul knew how to exploit this state of affairs in order to conduct his struggle against the Roman state. Nothing has changed. The method has remained sound. Under cover of a pretended religious instruction, the priests continue to incite the faithful against the state. From this writing, we can infer that Hitler believed the writers of the Bible were speaking of real events and real people. But we know, as Hitler did, that the Jews are master deceivers and wouldn't stop their treachery with this book. If he had a chance to study the OLB, he would probably notice the similarities between the Bible stories and actual events that happen in the journeys of the Fryan people. He would also see that there was a Christ or Krishna 300 years prior to the era of this Christ, who was made into a god upon his death in India. Nowhere does the OLB mention this Jesus Christ of the Mediterranean, an area that they colonized, did frequent trade with, and knew very well. If he was such an important man, this Jesus, God incarnate, living during the 1st century AD, the Fryans would have surely written about him in their memoirs. But they didn't. From the OLB on Jesus we read, 16 times 100 years after Atlan was submerged, 593 BC, something happened which nobody had contemplated. In the heart of Findusland, upon a mountain, lies a plain called Casimir. There a child was born whose mother was the daughter of a king, and whose father was a high priest. In order to hide the shame, they were obliged to renounce their own blood. Therefore he was taken out of town to poor people. As the boy grew up, nothing was concealed from him. So he did all in his power to acquire wisdom. His intellect was so great that he understood everything that he saw or heard. The people regarded him with respect, and the priests were afraid of his questions. His first name was Jesus, but the priests who hated him called him foe, that is, false. The people called him Christen, that is, shepherd, and his Fryan friend called him Buddha, because he had a treasure of wisdom in his head, and in his heart a treasure of love. The religious ideas of the Romans are common to all Aryan peoples. The Jew, on the other hand, worshipped and continues to worship then and now nothing but the golden calf. The Jewish religion is devoid of all metaphysics and has no foundation but the most repulsive materialism. That's proved even in the concrete representation they have of the beyond, which for them is identified with Abraham's bosom. It's interesting to note that in the OLB it speaks of the golden calf as well. The Magi mentioned here are the precursors to the Jews of today, we read. The leading men and their sturdy sons crawled to the unchaste Finnish girls, and their own daughters, led astray by this vile example, allowed themselves to be charmed by the handsome Finnish lads, to the ridicule of their degenerated parents. When the Magi got sniff of this, he took the most attractive of his Finns and Magyar and promised them cows with golden horns to let them be taken in, employed by our people in order to spread his doctrines. His people did even more. Children disappeared, were taken away to Uppsala, and after they had been brought up in his filthy doctrines, were sent back. Adela, 559 BC. It's striking to observe that Christian ideas, despite all St. Paul's efforts, had no success in Athens. The philosophy of the Greeks was so much superior to this poverty-stricken rubbish that the Athenians burst out laughing when they listened to the apostles' teaching. But in Rome, St. Paul found the ground prepared for him, His egalitarian theories had what was needed to win over a mass composed of innumerable uprooted people. Remember from the OLB that the Athenians were Fryans, our people. The Romans were already a mixed breed by that time, so our ancestors were not duped by the Magi back then. Rome was Bolshevized, and Bolshevism produced exactly the same results in Rome as later in Russia. It was only later, under the influence of the Germanic spirit, that Christianity gradually lost its openly Bolshevistic character. It became, to a certain degree, tolerable. Today, when Christianity is tottering, the Jew restores to pride of place Christianity in its Bolshevistic form. The Jew believed he could renew the experiment. Today, as once before, the object is to destroy nations by vitiating their racial integrity. It's not by chance that the Jews in Russia have systematically deported hundreds of thousands of men, delivering the women whom the men were compelled to leave behind to males imported from other regions. They practiced on a vast scale the mixture of races. As you can see here, what Hitler mentioned is exactly what they're doing today with the implementation of the Kalergi plan. If Hitler only knew how bad things could get, I think even he would be shocked. Anti-miscegenation is also mentioned in the OLB. We read of the Berg matron's advice about Lyda or Finda wanting to marry one of Frya's children. Should any of them desire one of your daughters as a wife, and she is willing, explain to her her foolishness. But if she still wants to follow her suitor, let her go in peace. If your son wishes for a daughter of theirs, you must do the same as with your daughter. But neither the one nor the other may ever return, for they would introduce foreign morals and customs, and if these were accepted by you, I could no longer watch over you. In the old days, as now, was the destruction of art and civilization. The Bolsheviks of their day, what didn't they destroy in Rome, in Greece, and elsewhere? They've behaved in the same way amongst us and in Russia. One must compare the art and civilization of the Romans, their temples or houses, with the art and civilization represented at the same period by the abject rabble of the catacombs. In the old days, the destruction of the libraries, isn't that what happened in Russia? The result, a frightful leveling down. Didn't the world see, carried on right into the Middle Ages, the same old system of martyrs, tortures, faggots? Of old it was in the name of Christianity. Today it's in the name of Bolshevism. Yesterday the instigator was Saul. The instigator today, Mordecai. Saul has changed into St. Paul, and Mordecai into Karl Marx. By exterminating this pest, we shall do humanity a service of which our soldiers can have no idea. Paul is Jewish Christianity. Marx is Jewish Bolshevism. Again, two sides of the same coin. 24th October, 1941, evening. Religion is in perpetual conflict with the spirit of free research. The Church's opposition to science was sometimes so violent that it struck off sparks. The Church, with a clear awareness of her interests, had made a strategic retreat, with the result that science has lost some of its aggressiveness. The present teaching in schools permits the following absurdity. At 10 a.m., the pupils attend a lesson in the catechism, at which the creation of the world is presented to them in accordance with the teachings of the Bible, and at 11 a.m. they attend a lesson in natural science, at which they are taught the theory of evolution, Yet the two doctrines are in complete contradiction. As a child, I suffered from this contradiction and ran my head against a wall. Often I complained to one or another of my teachers against what I had been taught an hour before, and I remember I drove them to despair. Today, we know that these two opposing views are both wrong. All humanity didn't come from Adam and Eve, and all humanity didn't evolve from apes. From the OLB, we get the story from our ancient ancestors, their belief on where humanity came from. We learn that originally there were three mothers that represented the three main races on Earth: white, brown, and black. The white mother was named Frya, the brown was Finda, and the black was Lida. Each tribe was always a separate seed. From the OLB we read, after the 12th Yule festival, she, Earth, gave birth to three maidens: Lida out of glowing, Finda out of hot, and Frya out of warm dust. When the last came, Frya, Waralda breathed his spirit upon her in order that men should be bound to him. When one says that God provokes the lightning, that's true in a sense, but what is certain is that God does not direct the thunderbolt, as the Church claims. The Church's explanation of natural phenomena is an abuse, for the Church has ulterior interests. True piety is the characteristic of the being who is aware of his weakness and ignorance. Whoever sees God only in an oak or in a tabernacle instead of seeing him everywhere is not truly pious. He remains attached to appearances, and when the sky thunders and the lightning strikes, he trembles simply from fear of being struck as punishment for the sin he's just committed. 25th October 1941, evening. What a certificate of mental poverty it was for Christianity that it destroyed the libraries of the ancient world. Greco-Roman thought was made to seem like the teachings of the devil. If thou desirest to live, thou shalt not expose thyself unto temptation. Bolshevism sets about its task in the same way as Christianity, so that the faithful may not know what is happening in the rest of the world. The same task is being done to us today in the digital world. Alternative views are being purged from YouTube, BitChute, Twitter, and the Internet in general. Books that tell the truth about World War II are being removed, and the ones that are available are at prices out of reach for most people. Christianity set itself systematically to destroy ancient culture. What came to us was passed down by chance, or else it was a product of Roman liberal writers. Perhaps we are entirely ignorant of humanity's most precious spiritual treasures. Who could know what was there? The papacy was faithful to these tactics even during recorded history. How did people behave during the age of the great explorations towards the spiritual riches of Central America? In our parts of the world, the Jews would have immediately eliminated Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, and Kant. If the Bolsheviks had dominion over us for 200 years, what works of our past would be handed on to posterity? Our great men would fall into oblivion, or else they'd be presented to future generations as criminals and bandits. We are fortunate to still be able to get the writings of men of truth such as Hitler, Himmler, and Nietzsche, but it is a struggle to sift through all the propaganda and lies put out there to even get to their works. It takes perseverance and dedication to get to the truth. I don't believe at all in the truth of certain mental pictures that many people have of the Roman emperors. I'm sure that Nero didn't set fire to Rome. It was the Christian Bolsheviks who did that. Just as the communists set fire to Paris in 1871, and the communists set fire to the Reichstag in 1932. Here we see that Hitler knew who was behind the Reichstag fire: the communists. I wasn't aware of the Paris fire of 1871, but when we do a search for it, we find that the Commune of Paris was an insurrection against the French government from March 18 to May 28, 1871. It occurred in the wake of France's defeat in the Franco-German War and the collapse of Napoleon III's Second Empire, 1852 to 1870. The Jews do love their fires, don't they? Like the Great London Fire of September 1666. 666. And their firebombing of Dresden just after the last entries of Table Talk from February 13 to February 15, 1945. Hitler also mentions Nero. Looking up Nero, we find that he is known as one of Rome's most infamous rulers, notorious for his cruelty and debauchery. So we know the opposite would most likely be the truth, that Nero was pro-Fryan, pro-Aryan, and so they have to spread lies about him as well. Methods of persuasion of a moral order are not an effective weapon against those who despise the truth when we have to do with priests, for example, of a church who know that everything about it is based on lies and who live by it. They think me a spoilsport when I rise up in their midst. Instead, I am going to spoil their little games. 5th November 1941, evening. Where we have a philosopher, they have a Talmudist pettifogger. What for us is an attempt to get to the bottom of things and express the inexpressible becomes for the Jew a pretext for verbal juggleries. His only talent is for masticating ideas so as to disguise his thought. He has observed that the Aryan is stupid to the point of accepting anything in matters of religion as soon as the idea of God is recognized. With the Aryan, the belief in the beyond often takes a quite childish form, but this belief does represent an effort towards a deepening of things. The man who doesn't believe in the beyond has no understanding of religion. The great trick of Jewry was to insinuate itself fraudulently amongst the religions with a religion like Judaism, which in reality is not a religion. Simply, the Jew has put a religious camouflage over his racial doctrine. Everything he undertakes is built on this lie. 11th November 1941, evening. I've always defended the point of view that the party should hold itself aloof from religion. We never organized religious services for our supporters. I prefer to run the risk of being put under the ban of the church or excommunicated. The church's friendship costs too dearly in case of success. I can hear myself being told that it's thanks to her. I'd rather she had nothing to do with it, and that I shouldn't be presented with the bill. Russia used to be the most bigoted state of all. Nothing happened there without the participation of the Orthodox priests. That didn't prevent the Russians from getting beaten. It seems that the prayers of 140 million Russians were less convincing before God than those of a smaller number of Japanese. It was the same thing in the First World War. Russian prayers had less weight than ours. Even on the home front, cows proved incapable of ensuring the maintenance of the established order. They permitted the triumph of Bolshevism. The man of today, who is formed by the disciples of science, has likewise ceased taking the teaching of religion very seriously. What is in opposition to the laws of nature cannot come from God. Moreover, Thunderbolts do not spare churches. Although one does not aim at seeking for truth, it is a kind of philosophy which can satisfy simple minds. Everything is finally a matter of the feeling man has of his own impotence. In itself, this philosophy has nothing pernicious about it. The essential thing, really, is that man should know that salvation consists in the effort that each person makes to understand providence and accept the laws of nature. What repulsive hypocrisy that errant Freemason Roosevelt displays when he speaks of Christianity. All the churches should rise up against him, for he acts on principles diametrically opposed to those of the religion of which he boasts. Hitler closed all the Masonic lodges in Germany. He knew this organization, ruled by secrecy, headed by the Jews, was being used against him. 20th November 1941. If the mental picture that Christians form of God were correct, the God of the ants would be an ant, and similarly for the other animals. Night of 1st December 1941. The toad knows nothing of his previous existence as a tadpole, and our own memory serves us no better as regards to our previous state. That's why I have the feeling that it's useful to know the laws of nature, for that enables us to obey them. To act otherwise would be to rise in revolt against heaven. If I can accept a divine commandment, it's this one: Thou shalt preserve the species. The life of the individual must not be set at too high a price. If the individual were important in the eyes of nature, nature would take care to preserve him. Amongst the millions of eggs a fly lays, very few are hatched out, and yet the race of flies thrives. Capitalism is an economic system that supports the individual. Fascism is an economic system that supports the folk, the whole tribe. The ignorant out there will then say, "It's just the same as communism." I reply with an emphatic no. In fascism, the government works for the benefit of the folk. In communism, the folk work for the government. It's a completely inverse system. One brings freedom and joy, unity in the tribe. The other makes men slaves to a small few who run the government, bringing misery and despair to the people. So if we are to follow nature, fascism would be the closest economic system to what is represented in the natural world, Hitler's system. Protestantism has the warmth of the iceberg. The Catholic Church, that still has its 1,000 years of experience and has not lost contact with its Jewish origins, is obviously more adroit. She permits the orgies of carnival, firstly because she is powerless to prevent them, and secondly because she recaptures the sinner on Ash Wednesday. By picturing to him the sufferings of hell, she succeeds in inciting him to be properly generous. After periods of repentance, there's room for relaxation. 13th December 1941, midday. The war will be over one day. I shall then consider that my life's final task will be to solve the religious problem. Only then will the life of the German native be guaranteed once and for all. I don't interfere in matters of belief. Therefore, I can't allow churchmen to interfere with temporal affairs. The organized lie must be smashed. The state must remain the absolute master. What is this God who takes pleasure only in seeing men grovel before him? Try to picture to yourselves the meaning of the following quite simple story. God creates the conditions for sin. Later on, he succeeds, with the help of the devil, in causing man to sin. Then he employs a virgin to bring into the world a son who, by his death, will redeem humanity. I can imagine people being enthusiastic about the paradise of Mahomet, but as for the insipid paradise of the Christians, in your lifetime you used to hear the music of Richard Wagner. After your death, it will be nothing but hallelujahs, the waving of palms, children of an age for the feeding bottle, and hoary old men. The man of the isle pays homage to the forces of nature, but Christianity is an invention of sick brains. One can imagine nothing more senseless nor any more indecent way of turning the idea of the Godhead into a mockery. A Negro with his taboos is crushingly superior to the human being who seriously believes in transubstantiation. The OLB warned our people to be aware of these Magi priests and Christianity. In it we read, "This doctrine, which requires the priest to possess no further knowledge than to speak deceitfully and to pretend to be pious while acting unjustly, spreads from east to west and will come to our lands also." By what would you have me replace the Christian's picture of the beyond? What comes naturally to mankind is a sense of eternity, and that sense is at the bottom of every man. The soul and the mind migrate, just as the body returns to nature. Thus, life is eternally reborn from life. As for the why of all that, I feel no need to rack my brains on the subject. The soul is unfathomable. If there is a God, at the same time he gives man life, he gives him intelligence. By regulating my life according to the understanding that is granted me, I may be mistaken, but I act in good faith. Man judges everything in relation to himself. What is bigger than himself is big. What is smaller is small. Only one thing is certain, that one is part of the spectacle. Everyone finds his own role. When all is said, we have no reason to wish that the Italians and the Spaniards should free themselves from the drug of Christianity. Let's be the only people who are immunized against the disease. 14th December 1941, midday. Curl, with the noblest of intentions, wanted to attempt a synthesis between National Socialism and Christianity. I don't believe the thing's possible, and I see the obstacle in Christianity itself. I think I could have come to an understanding with the popes of the Renaissance. Obviously, their Christianity was a danger on the practical level, and on the propaganda level, it continued to be a lie. But a pope, even a criminal one, who protects great artists and spreads beauty around him, is nevertheless more sympathetic to me than the Protestant minister who drinks from the poisoned spring. Pure Christianity, the Christianity of the catacombs, is concerned with translating the Christian doctrine into facts. It leads quite simply to the annihilation of mankind. It is merely wholehearted Bolshevism under a tinsel of metaphysics. Night of 28th to 29th December 1941. If I have an observatory built at Linz, I'll have the following words carved on its front: "The heavens proclaim the glory of the eternal." 7th January 1942, evening. Everything about the behavior of American society reveals that it's half Judaized and the other half Negrified. Night of 16th to 17th January 1942. Every year about Christmas, the children rig themselves out in terrifying masks, a survival of a period when people thought that in this way they could chase away evil spirits. Bad spirits gather in wild and desolate regions. This belief in evil spirits was brought about by the Magi. The Fryans had no such need for superstition. From the OLB we read, "The priests are the only masters. They call themselves Magyarar, and their headman is known as Magi. He is high priest and king in one. The rest of the people are of no account, and under their rule. These people do not even have a name, but we call them Finna, because although their festivals are all melancholic and bloody, they are so formal that we are inferior to them in this respect. They are not to be envied, though, because they are slaves to their priests, and much more to their creeds. They believe that evil spirits are everywhere and enter into people and animals, but of Waralda's spirit they know nothing." 27th January 1942, midday. But for the coming of Christianity, who knows how the history of Europe would have developed? Rome would have conquered all Europe, and the onrush of the Huns would have been broken on the legions. It was Christianity that brought about the fall of Rome, not the Germans or the Huns. What Bolshevism is achieving today on the materialist and technical level, Christianity had achieved on the metaphysical level. When the crown sees the throne totter, it needs the support of the masses. It would be better to speak of Constantine the traitor and Julian the loyal than of Constantine the Great and Julian the apostate. What the Christians wrote against the Emperor Julian is approximately of the same caliber as what the Jews have written against us. The writings of the Emperor Julian, on the other hand, are products of the highest wisdom. If humanity took the trouble to study and understand history, the resulting consequences would have incalculable implications. One day, ceremonies of thanksgiving will be sung to fascism and National Socialism for having preserved Europe from a repetition of the triumph of the underworld. That's who triumphed today, the underworld. Can't you tell all around you? Notice mainstream history teaches us the opposite of true again and again. Night of 3rd to 4th February 1942. There are towns in Germany from which all joy is lacking. I'm told that it's the same thing in certain Calvinistic regions of Switzerland. In Trier and Freiburg, women have addressed me in so ignoble a fashion that I cannot make up my mind to repeat their words. It's on such occasions that I become aware of the depth of human baseness. Clearly, one must not forget that these areas are still feeling the weight of several centuries of religious oppression. Near Würzburg, there are villages where literally all the women were burned. We know of judges of the court of the Inquisition who gloried in having had 20,000 to 30,000 witches burned. Long experience of such horrors cannot but leave indelible traces upon a population. Note that these would be white European women, Fryans. What a despicable religion that would torture and murder our own on the whim of the Church. In Madrid, the sickening odor of the heretic's pyre remained for more than 2 centuries, mingled with the air one breathed. If a revolution breaks out again in Spain, one must see in it the natural reaction to an interminable series of atrocities. One cannot succeed in conceiving how much cruelty, ignominy, and falsehood the intrusion of Christianity has spelled for this world of ours. The misdeeds of the people of Rome, having seen them at work, always knew exactly the worth of the popes before whom Christendom prostrated itself. For centuries, no pope died except by the dagger, poison, or the hoe. I can very well imagine how this collective madness came to birth. A Jew was discovered to whom it occurred that if one presented abstruse ideas to non-Jews, the more abstruse these ideas were, the more the non-Jews would rack their brains to try to understand them. The fact of having their attention fixed on what does not exist must make them blind to what exists. An excellent calculation of the Jew's part. So the Jew smacks his thighs to see how his diabolic stratagem has succeeded. He bears in mind that if his victim suddenly became aware of these things, all Jews would be exterminated. But this time the Jews will disappear from Europe. The world will breathe freely and recover its sense of joy when this weight is no longer crushing its shoulders. What a different world we would have had today if Hitler won. Compare it to what is going on right now. Which would you choose? 8th February 1941, midday. We shan't be able to go on evading the religious problem much longer. If anyone thinks it's really essential to build the life of human society on a foundation of lies, well, in my estimation, such a society is not worth preserving. If, on the other hand, one believes that truth is the indispensable foundation, then conscience bids one intervene in the name of truth and exterminate the lie. 17th February 1942, midday. The sensational event of the ancient world was the mobilization of the underworld against the established order. This enterprise of Christianity had no more to do with religion than Marxist socialism has to do with the solution of the social problem. The notions represented by Jewish Christianity were strictly unthinkable to Roman brains. The gods, for the Romans, were familiar images. It is somewhat difficult to know whether they had any exact idea of the beyond. For them, eternal life was personified in living beings, and it consisted in a perpetual renewal. Those were conceptions fairly close to those which were current among the Japanese and Chinese at the time when the swastika made its appearance among them. It was necessary for the Jew to appear on the scene and introduce that mad conception of a life that continues into an alleged beyond. It enables one to regard life as a thing that is negligible here below, since it will flourish later, when it no longer exists. Under cover of a religion, the Jew has introduced intolerance in a sphere in which tolerance formerly prevailed. Amongst the Romans, the cult of the sovereign intelligence was associated with the modesty of a humanity that knew its limits, to the point of consecrating altars to the unknown God. The Jew who fraudulently introduced Christianity into the ancient world in order to ruin it, reopened the same breach in modern times, this time taking as his pretext the social question. It's the same sleight of hand as before. Just as Saul was changed into St. Paul, Mordecai became Karl Marx. Peace can result only from a natural order. The condition of this order is that there is a hierarchy among nations. The most capable nations must necessarily take the lead. In this order, the subordinate nations get the greater profit, being protected by the more capable nations. When I first woke up and was looking into the Jewish influence on the world, I thought that the Jew fed America's economy, and that was why we were a rich nation. But I ended up realizing that it is not due to the influence of the Jew. Instead, it is due to the type of person, namely, the industrious, inventive people of Frya that make a country first world. No matter where Fryans go, no matter how little resources they have, it is the people of Frya that make the country great. Look at a nation like Mexico, who has a ton of natural resources at its disposal and still can't get its people out of poverty. Or South Africa, as another example, which was a desert and would have remained so if only peopled by lichens. But the Fryans came and turned it into a veritable Eden. You can see in the model South Africa is listed as third world. That is because Lida now rules there, and the economy is in a steep decline. When it was ruled by Fryans, it was a first world nation. So yes, I agree with Hitler that there is a natural order of things when it comes to world as people. It is Jewry that always destroys this order. It constantly provokes the revolt of the weak against the strong, of bestiality against intelligence, of quantity against quality. It took 14 centuries for Christianity to reach the peak of savagery and stupidity. We would therefore be wrong to sin by excess of confidence and proclaim our definite victory over Bolshevism. The more we render the Jew incapable of harming us, the more we shall protect ourselves from this danger. The Jew plays in nature the role of a catalyzing element. A people that is rid of its Jews returns spontaneously to the natural order. And since Hitler ended up losing this war, the Jew is harming us by every means possible today. We have reached the peak of debauchery and stupidity. We need a reset to get us back to the natural order of things. In 1925, I wrote in Mein Kampf, and also in an unpublished work, that world Jewry saw in Japan an opponent beyond its reach. The racial instinct is so developed among the Japanese that the Jew realizes he cannot attack Japan from within. He is therefore compelled to act from the outside. It would be to the considered interests of England and the United States to come to an understanding with Japan. But the Jew will strive to prevent such an understanding. I gave this warning in vain. A question arises. Does the Jew act consciously and by calculation, or is he driven on by his instinct? I cannot answer this question. Night of 20th to 21st February 1942. Man seizes hold, here and there, of a few scraps of truth, but he couldn't rule nature. He must know that, on the contrary, he is dependent on creation, and this attitude leads further than the superstitions maintained by the Church. Christianity is the worst of the regressions that mankind can ever have undergone, and it's the Jew who, thanks to this diabolic invention, has thrown him back 15 centuries. The only thing that would be still worse would be victory for the Jew through Bolshevism. If Bolshevism triumphed, mankind would lose the gift of laughter and joy. It would become merely a shapeless mass, doomed to grayness and despair. And that's what's happening today. The priests of antiquity were closer to nature, and they sought modestly for the meaning of things. Instead of that, Christianity promulgates its inconsistent dogmas. Within it, intolerance and persecution. It's the bloodiest conceivable. Kepler lived at Linz, and that's why I chose Linz as the place for our observatory. His mother was accused of witchcraft and was tortured several times by the Inquisition. Johannes Kepler, like Hitler, believed that Earth was a planet and that it revolved around the sun. We have to remember that we grew up with ball Earth and heliocentrism as well, and until it came on our radar as something we needed to look into, most of us didn't question this. The same thing is happening to music as is happening to beauty in a world dominated by the shavelings. The Christian religion is an enemy to beauty. The Jew has brought the same trick upon music. He has created a new inversion of values and replaced the loveliness of music by noises. Surely the Athenian, when he entered the Parthenon to contemplate the image of Zeus, must have had another impression than the Christian who must resign himself to contemplating the grimacing face of a man crucified. Imagine if Hitler could hear the music of today, rap, hip-hop, and boy bands. He would have thought jazz and rock and roll bad, but no, it had gotten much worse. He is right that music has sunk so low because of the Jewish influence. Since my 14th year, I have felt liberated from the superstition that the priests used to teach. Apart from a few holy Joes, I can say that none of my comrades went on believing in the miracle of the Eucharist. The only difference between then and now is that in those days I was convinced one must blow up the whole show with dynamite. 26 February midday. I realize, for my own part, that if I were offered the choice between nakedness on this earth, with the compensation of supreme happiness in the world beyond, and an earthly paradise, I certainly wouldn't choose to sing hallelujahs until the end of time. In virtue of what law, divine or otherwise, should the rich alone have the right to govern? The world is passing at this morning through one of the most important revolutions in human history. We are witnessing the final somersaults of Christianity. It began with the Lutheran Revolution. The revolutionary nature of that rebellion lies in the fact that until then there had been only one authority on both the spiritual and the temporal level, that of the Pope, for it was he who delegated temporal power. Dogma cannot resist the ceaselessly renewed attacks of the spirit of free inquiry. One cannot teach at 10 o'clock in the morning truths which one destroys in the 11 o'clock lesson. What is ruining Christianity today is what once ruined the ancient world. The pantheistic mythology would no longer suit the social conditions of the period. As soon as the idea was introduced that all men were equal before God, that world was bound to collapse. Hitler knew all men are not created equal, just like in nature. The border collie has supreme intelligence and agility over the pug. Man can still have an amicable relationship, with each knowing its proper place in nature's design. Then all races prosper. 27th February 1942, midday. Why doesn't God give everybody the possibility of understanding truth? Every man of average culture knows that at this precise moment the Catholic religion is of interest to just 1/10 of the population of the globe. He's astonished, too, that Providence, which has willed all that, can allow so many religions, all true from the point of view of those who practice them, to compete for the faith of the faithful. He knows, too, thanks to the view in depth that history enables him to take, that the Christian religion interests only those living in a tiny period of life of mankind. God made men, but thanks to original sin, we are men in the image of our world, earning our bread in the sweat of our brow. Again here, Hitler is giving his opinion based on his premise that the Bible is true as to original sin. If he read the OLB, he would have seen that we have Eva in our hearts and that we were not born as sinners. From the OLB we read, "The word Eva is too sacred for common use. Therefore, men have learned to say Evan." Eva means that knowledge which is implanted in the breast of every man in order that he may know what is right and wrong, and by which he is able to judge his own deeds and those of others, that is to say, if he had been well and not badly brought up. And earning our bread at the sweat of our brow is natural law. It is the same way for all creation. For 5,000 years, God impassively contemplated the spectacle of which he is the author. Then one day he decided to send upon his only son. You remember the details of that complicated story. Those who don't believe should, it seems, have faith imposed on them by force. If God is truly interested in men being enlightened, one wonders why he resorts to torture for that purpose. While we're on the subject, let's add that even amongst those who claim to be good Catholics, very few really believe in this humbug. Only old women, who have given up everything because life has already withdrawn from them, go regularly to church. All that's dead wood, and one shouldn't waste one's time in concerning oneself with such brains. In the trade union formed by the church, many of the members have tangible interest to defend and see no further. Notice Hitler comparing the church with trade unions. One of the first things he did as Führer was to abolish the Jew-run trade unions that were there only to undermine any true change for the workers. Same for the church. They are there to undermine any change that would be beneficial to the people, because it would be detrimental to the church. Why should men fight to make their point of view triumph if prayer should be enough? In the Spanish struggle, the clergy should have said, "We defend ourselves by the power of prayer." But they deemed it safer to finance a lot of heathens so that Holy Church could save her skin. If I'm a poor devil and die without having had time to repent, I'm all right. But if, as a preliminary, I can dispose of 10 marks to the church's benefit, my affairs appear in a more favorable light. And is that what God would have wanted? That little country girls and simple working men should be set dancing to that tune? That's a thing that can be explained. Absolutions. Ab is another word for God, as in ordo ab chaos, meaning out of, yes, but also short for God, as we are told in Morals and Dogma. The A, alpha, and B, beta, or end. Also in Hebrew it means Father. So absolution is God solution. This God solution is to pay up with an absolution. When money and God go hand in hand, that can only be the workings of the Jew. And we do know that the Pope's bankers are Jewish. And we also know that the Pope wears a Jewish yarmulke. When it comes to art, we have abstract, which is also another Jewish invention. Abstract art. Hitler was into real art, not shapes on a canvas or paint splashings. But that intelligent men should make themselves accomplices to such superstitions, and that it's because of these superstitions, and in the name of love, that hundreds of thousands of human beings have been exterminated in the course of history, that is something I cannot admit. I shall never believe that what is founded on lies can endure forever. That is something I cannot admit. I shall never believe that what is founded on lies can endure forever. I believe in truth. I'm sure that, in the long run, truth must be victorious. It's probably that, as regards religion, we're about to enter an era of tolerance. Everybody will be allowed to seek his own salvation in the way that suits him best. The ancient world knew this climate of tolerance. Nobody took to proselytizing. Instead, because Bolshevism won, we are in an era of complete intolerance. Every type of group is pitted against every other type of group. Race against race, gender against gender, religion against religion, political party against political party, vegans against meat eaters, and on and on. If I enter a church, it's not with the idea of overturning idols. It's to look for and perhaps to find beauties in which I'm interested. It would always be disagreeable for me to go down to posterity as a man who made concessions in this field. I realize that man, in his imperfection, can commit innumerable errors, but to devote myself deliberately to error, that is something I cannot do. I shall never come personally to terms with the Christian lie. In acting as I do, I am very far from the wish to scandalize. But I rebel when I see the very idea of providence flouted in this fashion. It's a great satisfaction for me to feel myself totally foreign to that world. But I shall feel I'm in my proper place if, after my death, I find myself, together with people like me, on some sort of Olympus. I shall be in the company of the most enlightened spirits of all times. I adopted a definite attitude on the 21st March, 1933, when I refused to take part in the religious services organized at Potsdam by the two churches for the inauguration of the new Reichstag. I've never concerned myself in the party with learning to which church the men around me belonged or did not belong. But if I were to die today, it would shock me to know that there's a single sky pilot within a radius of 10 kilometers around me. The idea that one of these fellows could bring me the slightest help would by itself make me despair of Providence. As far as I'm concerned, I act according to my convictions. I don't prevent anyone from praying silently, but I rebel against all blasphemy. So let nobody waste prayers on me that I shall not have asked for. If my presence on earth is providential, I owe it to a superior salvation of souls, and I find it really too cruel. I admit that one cannot impose one's will by force, but I have a horror of people who enjoy inflicting sufferings on others' bodies and tyranny upon others' souls. Our epoch will certainly see the end of the disease of Christianity. It will last another 100 years perhaps. My regret will have been that I couldn't, like whoever the prophet was, behold the promised land from afar. We are entering into a conception of the world that will be a sunny era, an era of tolerance. Man must be put in a position to develop freely the talents that God has given him. What is important above all is that we should prevent a greater lie from replacing the lie that is disappearing. The world of Judeo-Bolshevism must collapse. 31st March 1942, at dinner. If the German people is the child of ancient philosophy and Christianity, it is so less by reason of a free choice than by reason of a compulsion exercised upon it by these triumphant forces. In the same way, in imperial times, it was under the empire of compulsion that the German people engineered its fusion beneath a Christianity represented by a universal church, in the image of ancient Rome, which also inclined to universality. 4th April 1942, midday. The fact that the Japanese have retained their political philosophy, which is one of the essential reasons for their successes, is due to their having been saved in time from the views of Christianity. Just as in Islam, there is no kind of terrorism in the Japanese state religion, but, on the contrary, a promise of happiness. This terrorism in religion is the product, to put it briefly, of a Jewish dogma which Christianity has universalized, and whose effect is to sow trouble and confusion in men's minds. It's obvious that, in the realms of belief, terrorist teachings have no other object but to distract men from their natural optimism and to develop in them the instinct of cowardice. 9th April 1942, at dinner. It is very curious that devout Christians like the British and the Americans should, despite their constant and fervent prayers, receive such a series of hidings from the pagan Japanese. It rather looks as if the real God takes no notice of the prayers offered day and night by the British and the Americans, but reserves his mercies for the heroes of Japan. It is not surprising that this should be so, for the religion of the Japanese is above all a cult of heroism, and its heroes are those who do not hesitate to sacrifice their lives for the glory and safety of their country. The Christians, on the other hand, prefer to honor the saints, that is to say, a man who succeeds in standing on one leg for years at a time, or one who prefers to lie in a bed of thorns rather than to respond to the smiles of inviting maidens. There is something very unhealthy about Christianity. Another peculiarity of the Christian faith, as it is taught by the Catholic Church, is that it is a school of pessimism rather than of optimism. The Japanese religion, on the contrary, rouses men to enthusiasm by the promise it holds of the rewards in the hereafter, while the unfortunate Christian has no prospect before him but the torments of hell. Such pessimism has a marked effect. Even a child of 3 can be made to acquire terror of mind, which will remain with him for the whole of his life. We all know many grown-up people who are nervous in the dark, simply because they have been told in their childhood that a boogeyman, a robber, or the like lurked in the shadows. It is no less difficult to eradicate these childish inhibitions than it is to free the human soul of that haunting terror of hell which the Catholic Church impresses on it with such vigor during its most tender years. A man possessed of a minimum of intelligence, who takes the trouble to ponder over these questions, has no difficulty in realizing how nonsensical these doctrines of the Church are. For how, he must ask himself, can a man possibly be put on a spit, be roasted and tortured in 100 other ways, when, in the nature of things, his body had no part in the resurrection? And what nonsense it is to aspire to a heaven to which, according to the Church's own teaching, only those have entry who have made a complete failure of life on earth. It won't be much fun, surely, to have to meet again there all those whose stupidity, in spite of the biblical tag, "Blessed are the humble of heart," has already infuriated one beyond endurance on this earth. Imagine, too, how tremendously attractive a heaven will be to a man which contains only women of indifferent appearance and faded intellect. Only those, we are told, with the minimum of sin shall enter through the gates of heaven. Now, in spite of the fact that the burden of sin must inevitably grow heavier with each successive year, I have yet to meet a priest anxious to leave this life as quickly, and therefore with as light a burden as possible. But I can name many a cardinal of 60 and over who clings most tenaciously to life on this sinful earth. When one examines the Catholic religion closely, one cannot fail to realize that it is an almost incredibly cunning mixture of hypocrisy and business acumen, which trades with consummate skill on the deeply ingrained affection of mankind for the beliefs and superstitions he holds. It is inconceivable that an educated priest should really believe all the nonsense that the Church pours out. A proof there, to my mind, is the fact that the priests themselves always try to confuse the issue on the subject of the swindle of dispensations and avoid whenever possible any discussion of the subject. In spite of these obvious faults and weaknesses, there are, nevertheless, a large number of intelligent people who preserve their faith in the Church. They believe that man requires some species of brakes on his activities and that, in spite of its many shortcomings, the Church represents the best deterrent that at present exists. The pity is that people who reason in this manner appear to forget that the Church does not strive to propagate its teachings by reason and gentle persuasion, but by force and threat. This is certainly not my idea of education. It is moreover obvious that, had the Church followed solely the laws of love, and had she preached love alone as the means of instilling her moral precepts, she would not have survived for very long. She has therefore always remained faithful to the ancient maxim that the right hand must not know what the left hand does, and has bowed to the necessity of imposing her moral principles by means of the utmost brutality, not hesitating even to burn in their thousands men and women of merit and virtue. Similar to Hitler's beliefs in the deceptive nature of the Church, in the very first chapter of the OLB we are warned of the same. It reads, "Beloved heirs, for the sake of our dear forefathers, and for the sake of our dear freedom, I beg you 1,000 times, O beloved, never let the eye of a monk glance over these writings. They speak sweet words, but they secretly tamper with everything that relates to us Frisians. To gain rich endowments, they conspire with puppet kings. These knew that we are their greatest enemies, because we speak to their people of liberty, rights, and the duties of rulers. Therefore, they seek to destroy all that we derive from our forefathers, and all that is left of our old customs. O beloved, I have been in their courts. If Waralda wills it, and do not strengthen us, they will altogether exterminate us." Written at Ludwerd in the 1803 year by the Christian Concept. Lico, surname Overlinda. We ourselves are today much more humane than the Church. We obey the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," by catching and executing a murderer, but the Church, when the executive power lay in her hands, crucified, quartered, and did him to death with indescribable torture. Maintenance of the nation's morale is a task which the statesman can accomplish just as well as any church. All he has to do is to incorporate in the law of the land all the moral beliefs of the healthy elements of the people, and then to support those laws uncompromisingly with the authority of force. 5th May 1942, midday. To those among them who, in their enthusiasm for the regeneration of our nation, go too far and hail me as a prophet, a second Mohammed, or a second Messiah, I can only retort that I can find no trace of any resemblance in myself to a Messiah. 5th June 1942, midday. It is a great pity that this tendency towards religious thought can find no better outlet than the Jewish pettifoggery of the Old Testament. For religious people who, in the solitude of winter, continually seek ultimate light on their religious problems with the assistance of the Bible, must eventually become spiritually deformed. The wretched people strive to extract truths from these Jewish chicaneries, where, in fact, no truths exist. As a result, they become embedded in some rut of thought or other, and, unless they possess an exceptionally common-sense mind, degenerate into religious maniacs. It is deplorable that the Bible should have been translated into German, and that the whole of the German people should have thus become exposed to the whole of this Jewish mumbo-jumbo. So long as wisdom, particularly of the Old Testament, remained exclusively in the Latin of the Church, there was little danger that sensible people would become the victims of illusions as the result of studying the Bible. But since the Bible became common property, a whole heap of people have found open to them lines of religious thought which, particularly in conjunction with the German characteristic of persistent and somewhat melancholy meditation, has often as not turned them into religious maniacs. When one recollects further that the Catholic Church has elevated to the status of saints a whole number of madmen, one realizes why movements such as that of the Flagellants came inevitably into existence in the Middle Ages in Germany. As a sane German, one is flabbergasted to think that German human beings could have let themselves be brought to such a pass by Jewish filth and priestly twaddle, that they were little different from the howling dervish of the Turks and the Negroes, at whom we laugh so scornfully. It angers one to think that, while in other parts of the globe religious teachings like that of Confucius, Buddha, and Mohammed offers an undeniably broad basis for the religious-minded, Germans should have been duped by a theological exposition devoid of all honest depth. When one seeks reasons for these phenomena, one is immediately struck by the extent to which the human brain reacts to external influence. A child, for example, who in its very early years has been frightened with the threat of a boogeyman in the dark, will frequently fear entering a dark room, a cellar, or the like. Among women, a fear of this nature inculcated in early youth often persists for a lifetime. On the other hand, there are dangers which, not ever having come to his notice, a man completely ignores. A child living in an area exposed to bombing, and to whom the dangers of an enemy air attack as a noisy firework display, and will not as a rule show the slightest sign of fear. The essential conclusion to which these considerations lead me is that we must do everything humanly possible to protect for all time any further sections of the German people from the danger of mental deformity, regardless of whether it be religious mania or any other type of cerebral derangement. For this reason I have directed that every town of any importance shall have an observatory. For astronomy has been shown by experience to be one of the best means at man's disposal for increasing his knowledge of the universe, and thus saving him from any tendency towards mental aberration. 4th of July, 1942, at dinner. When Charlemagne was kneeling in prayer in St. Peter's, Rome, at Christmas in the year 800, the Pope giving him no time to work out the possible effects of so symbolic an action, suddenly bent down and presto, popped a golden crown on his head. By permitting it, the emperor delivered himself and his successors into the hands of a power which subjected the German government and the German people to 500 years of martyrdom. Today, as always, there are responsible people to be found who are careless enough to allow a crown of gold to be popped onto their heads, and one cannot exaggerate the enormous effects which such an action, seemingly trifling at the time, can later produce. 1st August 1942, evening. The Church has succeeded in striking a very pretty balance between life on earth and in the hereafter. On earth, they say, the poor must remain poor and blessed, for in heaven the earthly rich will get nothing, and the unfortunate poor on earth believe them. I think Hitler would agree on what the OLB said on this topic. Here we learn of a Jesus, Buddha, who lived 300 years before the Jesus of the Bible. The Magi priests manipulated the people after his death, turning him into a god. From the OLB we read, although they knew that Jesus had taught that men should regulate and control their passions, they taught that men should stifle their passions, and that the perfection of humanity consisted in being as unfeeling as the cold stones. In order to make the people believe that they did as they preached, they pretended poverty, and that they had overcome all sensual feelings. They took no wives. But if any young girl had made a false step, it was quickly forgiven. The weak, they said, were to be assisted, and to save their souls, men must give largely to the Church. Christianity, by adhering to a conception of the beyond which is constantly exposed to the attacks of unceasing progress, and by binding it so closely to many of the trivialities of life which may at any moment collapse, is ripening mankind for conversion to materialistic Bolshevism. And that is a terrible tragedy. Man will lose all sense of proportion, and once he considers himself to be the Lord of the universe, it will be the end of everything. And we're at that point now. 16th May 1944, evening. In the great hall of the Linz Library are the busts of Kant, Schopenhauer, and Nietzsche, the greatest of our thinkers, in comparison with whom the British, the French, and the Americans have nothing to offer. His complete refutation of the teachings, which were a heritage from the Middle Ages, and of the dogmatic philosophy of the Church, is the greatest of the services of which Kant has referred to us. It is on the foundation of Kant's theory of knowledge that Schopenhauer built the edifice of his philosophy, and it is Schopenhauer who annihilated the pragmatism of Hegel. I carried Schopenhauer's work with me throughout the whole of the First World War. So Hitler would have been aware of the Hegelian dialectic being used so often against humanity today. From him I learned a great deal. Schopenhauer's pessimism, which springs partly, I think, from his own line of philosophical thought, and partly from subjective feeling, and the experiences of his own personal life, has been far surpassed by Nietzsche. Night of 29th to 30th November 1944. Jesus was most certainly not a Jew. The Jews would never have handed one of their own people to the Roman courts. They would have condemned him themselves. It is quite probable that a large number of the descendants of the Roman legionaries, mostly Gauls, were living in Galilee, and Jesus was probably one of them. His mother may well have been a Jewess. Jesus fought against the materialism of his age and therefore against the Jews. Notice here that at no time does Hitler think of Aryans as a tribe of Israel. He mentions Jesus being an Aryan Galilean that came with the Romans, so he would have come from Europe, not from Israel. Christian identity would probably take Hitler's comments here and skew them to their own theory, but it really doesn't work. Again, Hitler is giving his interpretation from the presumption that what is written in the Bible is true. If he had a chance to study the OLB, then I think he would come to a very different conclusion on Jesus. Paul of Tarsus, who was originally one of the most stubborn enemies of the Christians, suddenly realized the immense possibilities of using intelligently and for other ends an idea which was exercising such great powers of fascination. He realized that the judicious exploitation of this idea among non-Jews would give him far greater power in the world than would the promise of material profit to the Jews themselves. It was then that the future St. Paul distorted with diabolical cunning the Christian idea. Out of this idea, which was a declaration of war on the golden calf, on the egotism and the materialism of the Jews, he created a rallying point for slaves of all kinds against the elite, the masters, and those in dominant authority. The religion fabricated by Paul of Tarsus, which was later called Christianity, is nothing but the communism of today. Bormann intervened. Jewish methods, he said, have never varied in their essentials. Everywhere they have stirred up the plebes against the ruling classes. Everywhere they have fostered discontent against the established power, for these are the seeds which produce the crop they hope later to gather. Everywhere they fan the flames of hatred between peoples of the same blood. It is they who invented class warfare, and the repudiation of this theory must therefore always be an anti-Jewish measure. In the same way, any doctrine which is anti-communist, any doctrine which is anti-Christian, ipso facto be anti-Jewish as well. French Revolution, class warfare instigated by the Jews. Marie Antoinette, Queen of France, was unjustly beheaded by the manipulation of the people. She never said, "Let them eat cake." That was a lie. The National Socialist doctrine is therefore anti-Jewish in excelsis, for it is both anti-communist and anti-Christian. National Socialism is solid to the core, and the whole of its strength is concentrated against the Jews, even in matters which appear to have a purely social aspect, and are designed for the furtherance of the social amenities of our own people. The Führer concluded, "Bergdorf has just given me a paper which deals with the relationship between communism and Christianity. It is comforting to see how, even in these days, the fatal relationship between the two is daily becoming clearer to the human intelligence." It was becoming clear in 1944, but is it still today? With their propaganda machines working 24/7 ever since, the people today are even more brainwashed. They can't see what a good, righteous man Hitler was. They are blind to the truth about Christianity. How will we ever be able to fight back when almost all of our people are stupefied? Remember, Christianity is Bolshevism, as Hitler tried to warn us. That means your Judeo-Christian neighbor is a Bolshevist. Your Mormon neighbor is a Bolshevist. Your Christian identity neighbor is a Bolshevist. And your atheist neighbor is a Bolshevist. We already knew that Antifa were communist Bolshevists, but did you ever suspect that their opponents, the Christians, were Bolshevists too? Jewish Christianity versus Jewish Bolshevism. They do really work both sides. What is the solution? Pick neither. Rise above the dogma of religion. See the world for what it truly is. Make an appeal to reason. Break the programming and become a free, sovereign being. Only then can we truly fight our enemies with all guns blazing. So it should be quite clear from Hitler's own words that he was not a Christian. I hope this has dispelled that myth for you. It has for me. He had a philosophy most aligned with the monotheist belief in Weralda that was our ancient ancestors' view on creation. I hope he is looking down from his watchstar, rooting us on. Heil Hitler and Weralda bless. Take care.